I am DM Zone. This is Gamers Oasis. Let's get into it. Okay, guys, so we're going to talk about man-to-man combat. I'm going to try and eliminate a lot of the side talk around this. Real quickly, I'm going to define man-to-man combat as this is mano-a-mano combat in a war game, in a fantasy game, and in a role-play game. Now, all these things were labeled, but they weren't necessarily known by those things at that point in time. I would say chainmail, where this originally the rules came from, was a mass combat system. I have a video talking about that specifically. I recommend you check that out to maybe understand how that works better. I'm going to be doing a video on fantasy, and I'm going to be doing a video on the alternative combat, the official rules for this. That was actually in the core 3 booklets. But in this video, I'm going to talk about the man-to-man. Man-to-man shares a lot of similarities with Dungeon the board game. Now, there's a couple versions of Dungeon out there, but the one you're looking for rolls 2d6 and has a target number to hit, just like the fantasy supplement does too. But I'll get into what the differences are in that video. I can't go down that rabbit hole. So I'm drawing my information from the strategic reviews that came out. And then there was 5 different supplements. And I'm drawing my information from the supplements too. Now really, in this video, I only need to pull from one. And that would be Supplement 1, Greyhawk, where he talks about some of these things in more detail. But I wanted to make sure you know that all 5 supplements are things I'm pulling from. Okay, so what makes this system different? Well, it rolls 2d6, you add these together, and that hits a target number. That target number then allows you to know whether or not you hit the certain type of armor class. No longer is the type of man wearing the armor a point of contention per se. So, for example, in mass combat, if you were a heavy horse, you had a different to hit than if you were a light horse. That part doesn't matter. This person is using plate, mail, and shield. I abbreviate that as PS, or chainmail and shield for CS, or LS for leather and shield, or just L for leather. You get the idea. When you watch my solo D&D videos, you'll see those type of things abbreviated in there. They had 4 different main combat systems for original Dungeons & Dragons. They didn't go into detail in all of them, so you kind of have to make your own characters. However, the board game, does a lot of this type of stuff. And I actually have a video out on that with a more modern day version of Dungeon the board game, and you can check that out too if you want. But that gives you an idea of like where this kind of comes from. So one of the things they have in there too is your fighting capability. In this version of the game, it talks about what bonuses you have and if you are considered a hero, a superhero, or a fighter, or just a man, or how many men you count for. And there are purposes for all of those, and I don't know because they're not ultra clear without adaptation from you what that means. It says both in the thing that you have an attack, and it also says that you have 1 attack for every man. I believe that is more of a mass combat situation. However, I don't necessarily think that that should be limited to 1 attack a round. But then you run into other complications, for example, that you can get more than 1 attack a round based upon how fast of a weapon you're using and how slow of a weapon they're using, which kind of solidifies the fact that no, as much as I think a person should be able to get more than 1 attack a round, if you're going to have weapon class matter that kind of way, which I'll get into this behemoth beast later of weapon class, I feel like you really do need to limit the parameters of that and just make it 1 attack a round. So in my solo game, I have 1 attack a round, unless the weapon class or speed, if you want to call it that, but weapon speed is something different, dictates that they get more than 1 attack. But we'll get into that in a second. One of the biggest limitations that a cleric has over a fighter is their choice of weapons But that only matters if you're using something called weapon class. Basically, they can use the same weapons, they can use the same armor, they can use a shield. So a lot of people are like, what's the difference? Well, the difference is they can use a mace, and only a mace for melee. And that's a big difference. There's no daggers, there's no spears, there's no polearms, technically. Though I would say there are some blunt, rounded polearms. But that's not necessarily meant to stop people from being able to be clerics, blunt-only things. They just want that fixed weapon speed that a cleric can have. And there's reason for that, because it gives the fighter more mobility and power in the man-to-combat when you're dealing with weapon class. Again, leading up to what in the world weapon class is. So man-to-man actually came out originally in Chainmail. When you want to go find the rules for man-to-man, you have to have the Chainmail supplement. Chainmail supplement version I had is 1973, which has the fantasy supplement, the first time that happened. Chainmail originally came out in 1971 or 68, depending on who you talk to. That is when you started to run into this earlier other types of combat. So you would have to have the right edition of Chainmail, which was $5 back then, not a small amount, as well as the $10 for the D&D books to be able to use this, which is probably why we don't use man-to-man now. But that was what it was back then. Some people feel like this combat is too complicated, too many little things, doesn't make sense. I think that's perspective. I think that's people trying to wrap what they believe combat is, or trying to say, I like this about this, so this doesn't work. This weapon class thing is too complicated and it's unnecessary. There are other answers, so I don't want to use it. And I think that's kind of where the bad influence, or whatever you want to call it, of this comes, saying that this was just too hard to learn. It wasn't really too hard to learn. You just had to kind of wrap your head around it in a few ways. And their writing of it was more complicated than it needed to be. If Tim Cass would have been there for the original 3 books, I think we would have a very different game when it came out. Or it may have just blown up in a pile of cinder and smoke, because it was so... some of the notes were so poorly included, shall we say, that he wouldn't have been able to understand it. No one was into this like Arneson and Gygax were. So man-to-man combat is very procedural. And procedural combat can really get like a flow to it. And people just know what they need to do and they go. There was a couple things that were very antiquated even for that time, that they like to do. Like they like to have orders wrote before combat would start, and then you would set your character out to go do these things. Now, in a mass combat, in a Brownstein type of game, which I have a video on that as well, I think that makes a lot more sense. In a man-to-man, I think it's a lot more fluid, a little bit more dynamic. The concept of being able to jump off of a table and grab the chandeliers, keen for anyone who has read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, the Conan series, all these things. And these all predate original Dungeons & Dragons. So the thought that these were a modern envisionment is not true. These were all in fantasy pulp type novels back then. It's just the rules didn't accommodate them as much as it did the J.R. Tolkien versions of type of things, and the movies kind of give it that chandelier feel without that actually being necessarily in the books. So one of the other things they had is anyone within 3 inches was considered to be in combat. 3 inches is 30 feet on a sand table, or 6 hexes, or 6 squares, on a grid. That's a very, very big area. No one's controlling 30 feet around them. This is, in my opinion, what I would consider an overrun or an overflow of mass combat rules. In the man-to-man, I always treated it as base or within 5 feet, and if you had a reach weapon, then you'd add 5 feet to it. If you were a giant or a dragon, you'd get 5 feet just because you're big, besides your big base. And that was a big thing back then. In mass combat and then some of these others, who went first didn't matter. It was just considered simultaneous. In man-to-man, there is no initiative roll, but your weapon class and where you are in proximity to them does determine whether or not you go first or second. And they have first and then they have second. If you have 3 people involved, technically they don't understand how to do that. I feel like I have a pretty good adaptation for that. And I do have Simo still. But I'll get into those a little bit as we go. So things like spears and polearms, I gave reach. I think that's very understandable. An extra 5 feet for being able to do that. And if someone is threatening your area, then they say you can't bypass them. However, I would say for sure Conan pushed past several people. They just got attacks on him as they did. Therefore, I believe in the counterattack of an enemy who chooses not to attack you but pushes past you. That is a very complicated way to say of opportunity attacks. But when I break down the way the rules read, those words of counterattack and choosing what you want to attack will make more sense, because part of the procedure, those were a thing that actually occurred in the original game. And again, some of these things here are never completely defined. So where I remember that these are my adaptions, I'll go ahead and tell you what they are. Otherwise, I'm just going to kind of state these things. This next part, this little lexicon I'm going to go over, and I'm going to have a little splash screen with this up, is going to be a lot of my adaptation or rechanging of the words, but I will also have the original text there for you to be able to read it and see it. Okay, so we're going to have Figure A. Figure A is the initial attacker. He is the one, or she is the one, that is initiating the combat for this instance. If there's a distance between them, then the one who moves into combat is considered to be Figure A. Figure D is the defending combatant. They don't attack, they counterattack. They can choose to counterattack or they can choose to parry depending on their weapon class versus the weapon class of the person they're fighting against. Now, this may sound really confusing, but again, you'll realize how black and white this really is, and it's not 40,000 thing, it's like 8, and it's really not that bad. And you can just look at a slide chart, which I will actually provide here in a little bit, and be like, oh, that makes a lot more sense. Well, why couldn't they just do this table versus trying to be complicated and the way they wrote it? And I think it's because of their understanding of the situation, the fact that people wouldn't necessarily get it. But we'll get into that when I talk about original Dungeons & Dragons. All right, counterattack. So counterattack is when Figure D decides that it wants to attack versus it wants to parry. This means that it gets to attack normally. It just generally goes, I won't even say generally. Based upon its weapon class, it will go first, it will go second, or it will go first and second, or it will go parry and second. Okay, so we'll get into that in just a second. Parry. Choosing to parry means that Figure A has -2 to hit you. If parry A hits, even still, there could be complications such as being disarmed or having your weapon break. We'll get into that, though, when we talk more about weapon class. Flanking. Flanking is when you're attacked from the side. This is very difficult, actually, in everyone is aware of everyone in the same situation, unless you're being ganged up on, and then maybe someone can have your flank. This is more of a thing for someone coming out of the shadows and attacking you, or you walk past a door and you get stabbed by a spear type of thing. When you are flanked, you automatically attack last. So you go after the attacker. They have the surprise on you. And surprise is a whole different thing. We'll get into that as well. But they are automatically going to have surprise on you. When you're attacked from the rear, not only do they get to go first in this round, but you don't get to go at all. And because they went first in that round, that gives them an advantage to go first in all future rounds. by the way. A mounted man or mounted troop, or however you want to view this, a person on horseback or elephant or whatever. They get +1 versus non-mounted people or man. Also, in the second round of combat, their mount, if they're trained, can actually attack non-mounted people, giving mounted people a huge advantage. Again, this takes it out of the mass combat of a heavy horse versus a non-heavy horse and kind of just puts it into a more standardized thing. You don't have to memorize those things. A non-mounted man gets -1 to hit mounted people. And that's basically it. They're basically regular dudes at that point in time. So you have a horseman, which is considered a mounted man. You have a footman, which is considered to be a non-mounted man. These are because they have so much crossover, because they have 4 different combat systems, just to help when you're reading the text so you can put this in your mind and understand what they're actually saying. High ground. Their reference of high ground is a little ironic to me, very situational. They talk about being on the ramparts or on top of a castle wall. I don't think people are attacking 20 feet below them with melee weapons. I think what that is in reference to, honestly, is a very specific thing. I think they're talking about people climbing ladders. However, kind of like Star Wars, I believe in high ground, that there are positional things you can do that will give you the benefit. And I say anyone that is on sure footing versus unsure footing has the high ground. Anyone who is on a high approach where they have more downwards attacks would have a benefit. That could be a low wall, that could be a roof, and it's a proper roof, like a low roof, but you're still able to melee. That could be a defended position versus an undefended position. So if you have spears and you're attacking through what they call murder holes, and you have a defensive wall between you and them, and you're inside a castle gate, you have high ground. That's just what it is, and I feel like that's what they're really trying to say what that is. Now, we're going to start getting into what we call weapon class. Weapon class is not a thing. It is several things. I view weapon class as sort of a combination of the weapons, attack style, reach, speed, and damage. They do not want someone with a D10 weapon attacking multiple times around. It's kind of baked in that the multiple attacks around is going to be a low hit dice thing, like a D4, maybe a D6. But that's just kind of baked into that. This will cause, the weapon class will cause what I call, and you will not find this word anywhere in there, but I think it helps with understanding the game, a time dilation. As in, we'll have Joe versus Billy Bob. They are locked in their combat. Their world basically separates out and their combat goes at whatever speeds they're going. But Eric and Nelson over here are fighting, and their combat is their own little thing. And when one of them resolves, even though Nelson might have got 4 attacks to every one of Billy Bob's attacks, it doesn't matter. When combat goes back, you just jump right into it at the round they're at, and it goes on. So it's like some things happen, kind of like a movie, like a Matrix type of thing, where they're doing the slow kick. That's time dilation. And you have to have that to make it work. I feel like it does work. I feel like it makes it very action-like, and it makes it fun for those who have really fast weapons to be able to get those more attacks, or the one with a really big weapon that just like, I get dink, 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 and you come down, boom, and then you hit that person and that person explodes and you move on. I think both of those are fun. Trying to link that to where everyone gets to go and you got one big boom every 4 turns everyone else gets to go is a little lackluster, and you run into a slow game. This game is faster because of that. Now, they talk about weapon breaks. If you have a weapon of a certain class and you parry versus another weapon of a certain class or whatever, the weapon break. I I don't personally like that. I like to have some variance, and I like to incorporate that in more than just that being the only way a weapon can break. When a weapon critical hits and you are parrying, I feel like that weapon has a chance to break. When you fumble a hit, regardless of what you're attacking, that weapon has a chance to break. None of this is inside the original rules. This is all my own adaptation. So if you watched Brith's personality playthrough where he attacks with his mace and he critically fumbles and hits the cave wall next to the orc with the spear, he gets his mace trapped inside stone. That was him being disarmed. When you make a weapon save, your weapon doesn't break, it's disarmed. Now, I think that is a very dynamic and cool way to go, and definitely would have been something they were very interested in. They just didn't think about it. This is my polish of playing different games and seeing how different things work, of taking that idea and kind of incorporating that in. I have a whole system for it. I don't want to get into it right now. I feel like that could be its own little, like combat adaptations. But essentially, if you have a wooden weapon attacking a metal weapon, you have less of a chance, and it's on a d6. So a 1 in 6 chance you go ahead and save that weapon from being broken. If it's metal versus metal, well, there you go. You got a 3 in 6 chance of the weapon not being broken, just being disarmed, or whatever funny thing might happen. And if you have a great weapon, it's a +1. And if you have a light weapon, which they don't actually classify in this game either, but something that is a mace or smaller, would be considered a light weapon. So anything weapon class 3 or less. Then you have a -1. So a great weapon versus a light weapon, you can see where the benefits go. This all, I think, makes intuitive sense. It's just another layer of combat that I like. This is my adaptation of a 50-year-old game. So when I looked into weapon class, it was very specific, in my opinion, to the man-to-man rules. It was very specific to Chainmail, as that was the system it came out in. There's not actually anything about weapon class in the original Dungeons & Dragons book, but they tell you to go to the Chainmail book to get this information. Weapon class ranges between 1 and 12. It does not work well for natural weapons, per se. There is no conversion. There would have to be a conversion if you were to only use man-to-man combat for these type of things. I'm kind of working on something like that because it makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of headspace that has to be put towards that because, an Umberhulk's claws have a lot of penetration, have a lot of reach, might be considered slow. Higher weapon class tends to go sooner, but weapons that, in the first round at least, but weapons that are higher weapon class tend to be higher damage, and for sure an Umber Claw claws are going to be higher damage. And do you ever go past 12 when you're dealing with fantasy creatures? And the answer to all that, in my opinion, is yes, and probably yes. I definitely, in my original thoughts, have weapon class beyond 12 because it makes sense that if a dragon is attacking, I don't care what your pike is, you're not going to go first in the first turn of combat. You might still get all of your other benefits, but the dragon still gets to go first. Mostly because the dragon has 20-foot arms and your pike is only 8 feet, 10 feet long, 12 feet long. So weapon class not only determines who goes first, but how many attacks they get. I'm going to break that down a little bit, and then we'll go into an example. So in the original text, they switch between different words, which is why I've gone with figure A and figure D. They switch between attacker, defender, opponent, and so on and so on. And it just gets really confusing, in my opinion. So the initial attacker, as I said before, is figure A. The one who closed in, the one who's choosing to attack, the one who went first last round and is now choosing to continue to attack. That type of thing. It's kind of like a two-step dance. You have a person who's leading and you have a person who's kind of following. If if the person is leading backs away, it's hard for the defender to go ahead and actually have anything to attack. Now, if they move in to attack them, they become figure A, taking on the lead, and the other one has now found themselves in defender D, or figure D, which is now the defender. They are now the non-leading step on the two-step. So the roles can change, which I think makes for a very dynamic combat as you're moving between I want to attack, I want to flee. So some of this, what this is it's really like the core base framework for what you're trying to do. Any of you have taken martial arts or been in any sort of combat thing where they're teaching you how to fight other people, whether it's boxing, judo, something in the military, whatever. They talk about doing things at 20% and 40% to kind of get the flow and the feel of things so that when you're going 100%, it makes sense. This is kind of that. You're building the framework to do these things. The 100% of this would be far more ugly, a lot more bumping in and slamming into each other, not being graceful. So this combat might be a little clean and some dirty tactics could be thrown in here. But I've not built that adaptation into the game, and I think it'd make for a very complicated game that only high-level players would actually understand and feel. And then it might be called like Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and you'd have its own little thing with weapon class and everything. But that's a different game, so we're not going to go into that game. Sorry. Okay, so it states in the figure A goes first unless figure D has a weapon class of 2 or more higher than figure A's weapon. So, for example, if figure A is attacking with a mace and they're attacking figure D who has a sword, which is a 4, weapon class 4, it's pretty clear, I think. One is not 2 or higher, so figure A would still get to go first. Their inertia, their momentum, their aggression would allow them to go first versus the one who is not being as aggressive, who would go then second. However, if figure D were to not have a sword and had a battle axe, which is weapon class 5, when figure A charged figure D would go first because they have a more aggressive weapon with a little bit more reach and would be more in the swing of things. Therefore, they would get to go first because it's 2 or higher. Now, let's go into an adaptation here. Going back to figure A having a mace and figure D having a sword. So you have the weapon class 3 versus 4. The mace goes first because of the aggression. If figure D has got high ground, in other words, they have some sort of defensive thing, or maybe figure A is running across squishy, mushy ground, then they would lose their go first and they would go simultaneous. This is how you can get to simultaneous combat in this. Now, if figure A goes first and they have the high ground, then they have just lock, stock, secured that. I've not thought hard or a lot about whether I'd want them to have the ability to parry, but maybe that is a thing that they could do. Not only do they get to go first, but they can parry the defender's attack. I could see that as being a potential thing, but I've not played that enough to know if that is something I want to incorporate into my game and how often that would come up. Okay, so now we made it to the first round. Now we're going to go into the second round. The second round goes like this. The second and following rounds. The figure that went first last round will get to go first this round, unless the other figure has a weapon class of 2 or less. Okay, so let's go back to this thing with the mace and the sword. The mace and the sword, the figure A gets to go first. The next round, he's only 1 below the sword, a 3, not a 2. Since the sword is a 4, so he continues to go first. Okay, look at the second alternative there. You have the mace versus the battle axe. First round of combat, the battle axe gets to go first because he is too high, or it is too higher than the mace. Next round of combat, the battle axe gets to go first if he went first, and if his opponent is not using a weapon 2 weapons classes below him. Well, the mace is 2 weapon classes below him, so now the mace gets a faster recovery and then goes back into him before he can bring the axe back around, and that nimbleness of the weapon allows him to attack before the battle axe can attack again. So what this is really showing is that there's a very dynamic bouncing back and forth. They have weapon recovery speed in there. They have the length of the weapon. They have the ferocity of the weapon, the damage of the weapon. All these things are really kind of being factored into this very complicated yet simple weapon class. And I feel like you could complicate it more by adding in that some people like to use the adaptation of a negative modifier to weapon class for high agility, meaning that the fence fighter has more ability to be quicker on its feet or of the mind to be able to get extra attacks in there. Very interesting concept. Personally, I don't like it necessarily just associated with dexterity. It's too much every time. There's no, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It's just too powerful by always working. I think there's a system in there, but I could see where that could be beneficial. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so let's look at this more. A person's using a mace, weapon class 3. They have 2 points from dexterity. That lowers that weapon class to a 1. You're going up against a battle axe. They get to go first the next round. You get to go first the round after that. Now, there's 4 points of difference versus 2 points of difference now between it. That is a whole different world, and you're swinging a D6 weapon versus a D8 weapon. Having a high dex should be beneficial, but I don't know if it should be every time that beneficial. We'll get into what that is in just a second, though. Okay, so let's get into parry. Okay. So if figure D has a weapon class 2 or higher than figure A, then they do not get the parry. So a battle axe cannot parry a mace. Maybe. I could see that potentially. But it also means they get to go first. So, is that really a bad thing? If figure D has a weapon class of +1 to -3 of figure A, then they get a parry, but they do not get to counterattack. Okay, so what that means is the guy runs, or the figure A runs up with a mace, figure D has a sword. They now can parry the mace with their sword, but they don't get an attack back. Parry, as we've already established, gives figure A +2 or a -2 to hit the armor class, which is actually way more than it is in current day D&D. That's actually pretty devastating. That's a lot of percents, essentially, not just 10%. However, if that attack goes through and they still hit their target, the weapon breaks. Now, I went over weapon breaks already in the lexicon. I don't necessarily think a weapon should automatically break 100% of the time. I think that magic weapons probably shouldn't break. I think that they're always considered to be disarmed. I think that you potentially could have some sort of thing to prevent disarm, but then you take damage to that limb. And that limb can only take so many hits before it becomes basically rendered less effective or useless, because you're basically taking all the stress onto that joint or joints. But it prolongs your ability to fight with that limb. I think all these things are things that are part of the game that could be run through adaptation. However, let's go ahead and jump this up a notch. Let's say that figure D has a weapon class of 4 to 7 points lower than figure A. So in this case, figure A is attacking you with a spear, which is weapon class 8, and you have a dagger. You can now choose, before attacking first, parry or parrying. And if figure A still hits, your weapon can still break. So what does that mean? It means that you can parry and then attack second, or you can attack first and you can attack second, because there's 4 points of difference between your attack and their attack. So you're either going to attack twice this round, or you're going to spend one of your attacks to parry. Does that make sense? And if it's 8 or more, then you have two options. You can either go first and parry first, as well as getting a secondary attack at the end, or you can strike first and get 2 attacks at the end of combat. Parry takes an attack. Basically what it is. You're spending an attack to reduce your opponent from hitting you by 2 points. You're fighting defensively. This is just like fighting defensively in any other game. A little bit different here. Maybe a little more complicated, but that's really what the root of everything they're trying to get at. So when you see all these numbers, just one chart could really let you know what your options are. And as you see, each one of these options, you are 2 weapon class higher. You're 1 weapon class to -3 weapon class. You're -4 to -7, and you're -8 or more. There's 4 options, and there's 1 to 2 options for each one of those. Like literally 8 things that you have to pick from. It's not as terrible as it makes it out to be. Mostly the part of the problem is you're having to look into other books. They use bad phrasing, and they try and get too complicated with the wording, in my opinion. And this is where the dexterity adaptation kind of throws a wrinkle in this whole thing, because you could have a weapon class of negative numbers or 0 when you're using something like a dagger. And do you get 3 attacks at the end versus just 2 attacks? I mean, is that a possibility? Could that be something that happens? I don't know. Like I said, it's too powerful for it just to be on all the time. But having like a setup, having this round I can do that, kind of like you do a feint, then the next round you can go ahead and use your dexterity for weapon class. I think that makes a lot of sense. None of that is in the original rules, though. There's not a lot of rules. Nowhere in there have I really found where people talk about switching weapons. I just consider that you get 1 free swap. So if you want to switch between a spear and a dagger, you sheath your dagger, you pull your spear. That's your swap. You want to pull out a shield, that takes a second round. You know, you stow your dagger, you pull out your shield. So you're fighting defensively. You parry with your shield, which doesn't actually have a weapon class. I just consider it probably to be able to parry. Next round, you drop your torch. You pick up your spear. Now you're using a spear. You're using your shield, and you're into a different type of combat. You're using a spear. You want to swap from that. You walk around with a spear and a torch. Same thing, just in reverse. I think that makes a lot of sense and sounds dynamic and cool. Also, when I was talking about certain fantasy monsters being able to have a higher weapon class than 12, you're opening them up to being attacked more times. Maybe they have to have some sort of safeguard against that. I don't know. And that's where a lot of the complication comes from. You have someone with even a weapon class of 13 or a weapon class of 14, and you have a dagger, and then they have an 18 dexterity because they're a rogue or a thief. They get 5 attacks at a round against you. That's a lot. And if you were to consider dual wielding, which could be a thing, that could be 6 attacks. That would be like basically fighting a ninja blender at that point in time, which is an amazing idea. But you have to really weigh into a lot of those type of things, because what if that ninja blender was like my first build of a character in AD&D in 1989, which was a dwarf named Zon, Z-O-N, who had an 1863 percentile strength, and ended up with +1 daggers in each hand. And he had his, was it +3, +5, +6 for the magic. So he was +6 damage per attack, and he was 5 per 2 at like 4th level, which I won't get into what all that means. But let's just say I attacked a lot and it hurt. I was doing more damage than the guy with a broadsword next to me. All right, so now we've talked a little bit about how the combat works. Let's talk a little bit more about how man-to-man moves it out of the binary a hit equals death and moves it more into the hit point range, which is a thing that was very much based in Dungeons and Dragons. That's where this came from. Some thoughts of being able to take more than one hit was in Brownstein in some of the later games, but the idea of hit points or hero points really came into it in original Dungeons and Dragons. Originally, they came out with everyone got a D6. They quickly changed that in Supplement 1 to having different types of dice, thieves and magic users having D4s, clerics having D6s, and fighters having a D8 as an example. And that kind of gave you your high hit potential type of thing. But in the man-to-man, you're moving away from this mass combat where you have 40 attacks and you just have to determine how many people live or die. You can't keep track of 40 different sets of hit point pools and all this type of stuff. And you're moving into the person-to-person combat where that actually matters. So this is a big part of that game as well. Well, let's pause right here for a second and take a look in consideration for what some people would either a simplistic game, or sort of like an ancient game that's poorly written in mostly an unknown language, as what it really was for all this. It really did kind of have like this dynamic flow that allowed real world theories that people in historical games would appreciate, because the phalanx fighter fights a certain way and the gladiator fights a certain way, and Vikings fight with certain weapons and don't necessarily have helmets with horns on them, and they're clashing against each other, and this makes sense. So this was a big part of what made original Dungeons & Dragons so good. It hit that in-between where people could meet and be good. And that's why Gygax really loved this version of the rules and didn't understand why people didn't like it. What he failed to understand, in my opinion, is he didn't put it in the rule book. He didn't put it in the core rule book. He put it in a different book that required people to get it. The rules he put in the rule book, he eventually gave in and allowed that to be like the official rules. But that took like a long time, like over 10 years, 15 years or something like that. It was a long, long time. It was basically about the time he left. Okay, guys, so in the next video, I'm going to talk about fantasy. And I'm going to break down to a lot of this. Fantasy works a lot like the man-to-man rules does, but you have to wrap your head around the perspective of it so much. I do not feel like I want to add that amount of video to this video, and I'm just going to go ahead and put that in its own little video. But basically it works off of the same system, same type of thing. Instead of having swords and maces and spears and daggers, you have teeth, fangs, stingers, claws, all those type of things. So when we get into that, we will look into this deeper. We'll save that for the next video. If you guys want to see more videos like this, please hit the subscribe. Let me know in the comments down below what you think, if I missed anything. If you have questions, I'll try and answer them there, or I'll do some sort of follow-up in a future video. Hope you guys enjoy this. See you guys in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.